Hello, and welcome to Sean's Check-In. If you enjoy following my videos, feel free to follow my Facebook page, Sean P. Daughtry, LICSW, or over on my YouTube channel, Sean D., Sean's Little Check-In, or Sean's Check-In. So today I wanted to just touch upon briefly a little bit more about the concept of dominance that I spent a lot of time talking about yesterday in a video. Um, so I think I emphasized more the biological kind of behavioral based aspects of dominance and what can bring on dominance, such as aspects of strength or mental acumen or combination thereof. However, dominance can come through too in societies according to what majority people in a society deem as most valuable, traits that are most valuable. And then from there, enabling people of those traits to have dominance over others. So there's some degree of social approval and permission given for certain people, therefore, to then dominate others, such as white people over people of color, for example, as well as males over females, etc. So I just wanted to touch upon that there's a lot of social valuing. And we are in a time now of challenging more and more old, ingrained, large-scale social values that, for example, tend to greatly come from a lot of valuing of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, at least in America, that's for sure. And that there's good, robust debate and challenge happening around valuing people who have traits in relational style and appearance from that culture, for example. So I just wanted to touch upon that dominance can be a socially sanctioned behavior on certain people and groups over other people and groups. So I just wanted to stop there and maybe come back to the topic of dominance at another time before I launch into briefly something else. And that's the concept of toxicity. In this day and age right now, there is a lot of usage of the word toxic. Toxic masculinity, toxic behaviors, toxic people, toxic relationships. Those are some main terms that come to mind around how toxic has been used more and more in the public lexicon these days. And I just wanted to step in around that and what's my thoughts about that and where it's helpful and maybe where the usage of the adjective toxic is maybe overused or can be and is at risk of being overused. First of all, like many of us, I am concerned about the labeling of people themselves as toxic. The term toxic person is not something I inherently believe in is the case. I believe that everyone inherently has a positive core true self. And yesterday I talked about what I mean by self in terms of all of us having these 8 qualities, the 8 C's of self that I've encouraged people to look up online. And you will find quickly the listing of the 8 C's of self and descriptions of each of those qualities. And of course, as I've said before, compassion and curiosity are 2 of those qualities of self. Now, I do entertain the possibility that there are some very rare few exceptions of people that maybe it's questionable if they have a core good true self. Or they have a very limited one, maybe a lot less of a core good true self than the rest of the general population of individuals do. And that's the very rare occasional born psychopath who immediately starting in childhood and onward has no empathy at all and causes great harm to others. Often starts out maybe killing animals and develops into being a serial killer, for example. There is ongoing debate around if such individuals have any core good true self in them at all. And I don't claim to have the full answer to that. I do leave room for the possibility that there's some goodness in there, some degree of self, maybe no compassion, um, maybe some limited curiosity, and these other qualities too are there. But it's limited, so therefore the equivalent of damaged, and just inherently so for any number of reasons genetically and what have you that are beyond my scope of study. So that exception or entertainment of a possible exception aside, I don't believe that people in general are inherently toxic. However, behaviors can be toxic. I help people recover from toxic behaviors that they've exhibited against themselves, that they've had exhibited against them, that they have exhibited against others. I help people recover from toxic behaviors. I say toxic because toxic means causing harm to oneself or others is inherently harmful. Uh, I think behaviors there's plenty of examples of negative toxic behaviors that happen. And of course, there are so many wonderful behaviors that are driven in people by compassion and natural, healthy curiosity. So there's a range there of how people can act, or if you will, behave, but certainly some behaviors are best accurately described as toxic. And that is labeling behaviors. That's not labeling the people themselves as inherently toxic themselves. Same with other terms that have been labeled as toxic, such as toxic masculinity. That, to me, succinctly explains a cluster of negative behaviors that have been fostered and enabled for a number of men in the general population to participate, engaging in. Again, it's about behaviors. It's not about the inherent worth or value or judgment of the people, the men exhibiting them. So I do want to be clear about that. And then there's a few other terms I touched upon that again have the descriptor of toxic in front of them. What I'm getting at is that it all comes back to labeling behaviors, actions in the world as toxic that do cause harm to others. And I think that is a valid point to make, that at the same time doesn't denigrate any particular human being themselves. However, there is the usefulness in a limited way around labeling some people sometimes in certain contexts as toxic. Now, where and what do I mean by that? Well, when I am helping a person recover from abuse, if they come upon this understanding that the person who abused them was horrible and is a horrible human being, and they come to that themselves, that I honor as a transitional place of healing. At first, they need to externalize that person as a negative, bad person to them. And that is a stage of going through grief and healing, is that anger where at first they label someone as bad or toxic. Now, I do not actually myself initiate labeling any person as that when I'm talking with someone who's recovering from abuse, but if that's part of their healing place, that they name a person as bad or toxic, that's understandable for them to go through that place for a while of naming them as such, where then eventually they see a bigger and bigger picture that that person too was suffering and that their behaviors were what were toxic inherently and bad, not the person themselves. It is often premature for me to correct that person and say, well, the person wasn't bad, their behaviors were. Depending on where the person is at with their healing, they may reject that and feel like I'm siding with the individual who harmed them. So I listen for them and let them move through their anger to eventually a more understanding place. That, by the way, may or may not involve direct forgiveness. Forgiveness is a whole other topic of when to forgive and when not forgiving is fine too. It just depends on the context. Now, Janice Abrams Spring, a psychologist, has written a wonderful book called How Can I Forgive You? And she talks in that book about when forgiveness is a helpful thing to do and when forgiveness is not necessarily indicated, particularly if the person to be forgiven themselves has not in any way at all acknowledged wrongdoing and denies that. Then you can still do a whole letting go process and sending compassion from afar to the person, but you do not have to explicitly forgive them. And she goes into more detail about that than what I'm just quickly summing up here. So that may seem like a tangent, but I do think it ties into this topic of toxic behavior and when it is okay to allow a person to label someone as bad or toxic who has been in their lives directly harming them. Again, as part of a movement towards deeper, bigger understanding of suffering that was happening for the person who was exhibiting such harmful behavior to the person who survived that behavior, who I happen to be helping as a client, for example. So I hope I've been clear here about these terms of toxic, toxicity and toxic in reference to humans and behavior. I do think that it is a helpful part of the general discourse that these terms are being brought up and utilized to start to label more and more certain kinds of behavior as harmful to huge amounts of people that must be stopped and no longer enabled or fostered in any way for that matter. So that's where I stand with these terms of toxic behavior, toxic this and toxic that. And if people have any thoughts further about this topic, feel free to leave them in the comments section and I will respond as best I can. Thank you for watching and look forward to having your participation in further videos of mine.